The following podcast is a live recording of a radio show first broadcast by FreshFM with assistance from New Zealand On Air.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for another episode of Fix the Money, Fix the World. I am your host Faris Mali, coming to you Monday mornings on FreshFM, and this show is proudly brought to you by myprivacy.help. If you ever do anything online and you need to know how to keep your data secure and private, go to myprivacy.help. And today's episode, now I actually had to reach out for some help because I was running out of topics. And, well, not running out of topics, but just wanted to see what was out there and what people wanted to know about. And a good mate of mine, loyal listener, suggested the economics of war. So we're thinking of what's going on in Ukraine, how much this is costing in human lives, but also in economic and monetary value. So we're going to probably make this a 2 to 3 week one. We're going to look at the history of war because it has a huge economic impact. Defense spending to rebuilding, it's all involved. I used to actually teach international relations. That's my background. It's what I studied. So war is kind of like a big part of that. I am going to give this an overview. So I haven't actually prepared that much because I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm just going by some memory, and hopefully I'm not going to have to make too many fact checks or errors. But if I do, please hit me up on my website, farismali.com. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about war. Now, if you go back and say, read your Bible or any old documents, war used to be fought for idealistic reasons, religious reasons. You didn't really, it was between groups or tribes. At times, yes, it would be for trade or securing goods or resources. Now, thinking, for example, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, those ideas, those kinds of resources where you need access to. We will be talking about those later. We had international wars that would be fought between governments. A lot of times those were for ideological. So I'm thinking specifically of the 116-year war between France and England. 116 years. Now, those two cultures are not that dissimilar. They look very similar. Their language is not that different. You can basically swim from one country to the other. And they were at war for 116 years. Why? Because one was Catholic, one was Protestant. So the head of the church at the time was the head of the state. Whoever was the head of the Roman Catholic Church or the head of the Church of England was the head of that empire, that state. So that was joined. The head of the church was the head of the state. There's a famous painting of Napoleon where he takes the crown. He's about to be crowned by the Pope. He takes the crown from the Pope, puts it on his head. And he's basically sending a sign that, no, I'm more powerful than the church. That obviously did not end up well for poor old Napoleon. So what we had back then was the economic policy that was largely in practice was called mercantilism. So mercantilism, in theoretical sense, is you have more exports than imports, which basically means you are creating the finished products. So you need natural resources. So you think of New Zealand today. We did an episode on cars recently. We don't manufacture cars here. We don't. Why? Because it's just so much easier and cheaper for us to buy them from Japan. So that is another theory that we're going to look into. But back then you wanted, so this I'm talking like leading up to the 16th century, so up to the 1500s, from 1200s, dark ages to 1500s, you wanted to control the manufacturing process because the finished good was where the money was. So in order to do that, you had to have the resources. And you look at the New World when France and England first went out to the Americas. They went out, there was a fur trade. And they warred with the local Indians and even in Canada with the Aboriginal people in Canada. They went to war there to control the fur trade. The same thing's been done in Africa. The same thing's been done in the Silk Road in Southeast Asia. You wanted to control the trade. And these armies, Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, the English, they fought to control the trade routes. I actually have not been able to confirm this, but it's a really cool story. I heard someone say that leading up to the Industrial Revolution, so before we created the engine, whichever empire had the land with the tallest trees controlled the world. Because the tallest trees meant the tallest masts. The tallest masts on a ship meant the fastest ships. So I've not come across it. I just thought it was a really cool story. It kind of makes sense, but I haven't actually been able to confirm that. So war was essentially the means by which you acquired new resources, and then you created a finished product. And back then, if you wanted, you couldn't just load up a ship and go invade another country. You actually needed a seal of approval from the king or the queen of your reigning country. So not anyone could just load up a ship and just head off. I'm going to go to the Americas, and you actually had to have a seal, because otherwise that would be piracy. So if you didn't have the seal to trade, then you couldn't trade. So the mercantilism as a theory, what it actually led to was a more and more centralized and powerful state. The head of the church, the head of the state, gained more power because essentially they allowed for greater trade and they benefited from it. So that's where we're leading up to the 16th century. The Industrial Revolution changed a few things, and I'm just going to do the Industrial Revolution as a sidebar because I'm actually going to devote more of an episode to that. So today we're just going to do brief history. So what happened in the 17th century, we then had called the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So this was a peace treaty that brought an end to a 30-year war in Europe, and this was a war between two royal families. But essentially, we had seen several wars. I mean, we had the Crusades, we had the Dark Ages, we had a 100 Years' War between France and England. We had, you woke up basically into war. The 30-year war saw 8 million people in Europe die. So the Treaty of Westphalia, what it actually did was a peace treaty, and this is where historians will debate this, but I'm just going to say here's what it is for sake of brevity and helping us understand this. It was the beginning of the separation of church and state, because what it actually created was the sovereign state. So we have states today. We have 198 sovereign states, I believe, which means there's passports from each one of these states. You can be protected by that state. Back then, you didn't have that. Territories would change who they fell under. I remember reading that Lebanon, the country of Lebanon, has had human civilization for 5,000 years. Of those 5,000 years, it has not had a foreign force occupying it for 60 years. So I'll repeat that. For 5,000 years, the country of Lebanon has had human civilization. Of those 5,000, only 60 years has a foreign force not been occupying it. So this is what happened with territories. They kept falling under different empires. So you go to England, you go to Spain, you go to all these other areas, and like that architecture does not look English or French, simply because powers changed. And they didn't know it at the time. I lived in North Africa, and there's Roman ruins everywhere. So what we ended up doing was, with the Treaty of Westphalia, saying, okay, we're creating a sovereign state, and then you can elect your own official. So the head of the church, the Roman Empire, was no longer the head of Italy and other countries in Europe. You had your own elected officials. So they say that the Treaty of Westphalia led to the sovereign state, which is what we have today, the individual sovereign state. States would then learn to trade with each other. So the theory is that states that trade together don't go to war. That's something we'll look at again. So they figured that if we remove the head of the church and the head of state as one, then we're actually going to prevent war, because a lot of these wars are for religious reason. The Crusades, 100-Year War, they were for religious reasons. So if we stop the head of the state, who controls the army, who controls the navy, who controls the finances, stop them from having that centralized power, then potentially we're going to stop wars. So that was one aspect towards going towards the Industrial Revolution, as well, coming into the Industrial Revolution, as well as what we see now, the separation of church and state. All right, I'm going to give my voice a rest. We are going to play Carry On by Fun. That was Carry On by Fun. If you are just joining us, welcome to Fix the Money, Fix the World with Faris Mali, and we are coming to you Monday mornings on FreshFM. Today we've started to talk about the economics of war. Why do countries go to war? What is the economic benefit? And we're just going through a brief history lesson, starting with pre-17th century. And we talked about mercantilism. So mercantilism was essentially you wanted to control the output. So you wanted to have more exports than imports, which meant you would go source the natural resources, natural materials. This led to colonization and imperialism. This is what created empires, and we saw wars that would happen between empires. A lot of them were over controlling the trade routes, because you want to go to the Americas to get the furs, to get the trees, to get the oil, because you wanted to have complete vertical integration of a product. You wanted to control it from A to B. There was no, if you look at a car today, for example, parts of a car come from at least 30 different countries. I think South Africa, most likely your seatbelt is made in South Africa. I think they have a huge majority there. So they didn't have that back then. You wanted to control the entire production process. So the head of the state would use the Navy, the Army to control trade. Now, what then happened is, we had the colonization of Africa and the Americas. The Americas obviously went through their War of Independence. And Africa, same thing happened much later, starting in the 1960s after World War II. Because what they decided was it's becoming more and more expensive to feed armies for diminishing returns, which basically means that if we're going out to get all these supplies, the cost of paying for an army, because as the Industrial Revolution came in, the cost of armies went up. Petrol, oil, when we used sailboats, the wind was free. And most of what you had to pay for was labor. Ammunition was not that expensive. Didn't really cost anything to sharpen a sword. But as militaries became more and more extravagant, more and more technological, the cost of running a military became really expensive. So to invade another country, get their natural resources, was not really cost beneficial. So we set up trading agreements. That's where they decided, 20th century, it's just cheaper to set up trade agreements, which largely were one-sided. And they started pulling their armies, their militaries out of Africa, parts of Asia, Central and South America, because that's what they feel. We just, control who's in power and set up trade agreements with them that are beneficial to us. So that's where we moved from mercantilism to what, in my opinion, was called free trade, but was never actually practiced. I think I've done a show about free trade. So it was supposed to be globalization and free trade, but it was never actually practiced as such. It was simply another form of one-sided trade. So what we've seen then with the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century, we saw the separation of church and state. The head of the church, who controlled the army, no longer controlled the flow of capital or the flow of trade. So we needed to remove that. So that was a really good start to getting free, independent, democratic societies. And then we started to see businesses come up. If anyone's seen Ocean's 12, they talk about the Dutch East India Company as what they're trying to steal is a stock certificate for the world's first corporation. The Industrial Revolution started, we saw the open of businesses. So we started to say, okay, you no longer need the stamp of approval to go overseas and trade. So we take that for granted today that anyone can just basically go overseas and start trading with someone. There are obviously you have to apply for companies kind of stuff, but back in the day, you actually need a stamp of approval from the king, and you couldn't even leave the country to do it. You're considered a pirate or a bandit. So the Industrial Revolution saw trade ramp up, and essentially the governments could not keep up with the times. So we had free trade come about, and I'm putting that in quotes because in theory, free trade looks great. It's never actually been practiced, and we'll talk about why in next week's episode. The other thing we had was when post-World War I, we had the League of Nations and the beginning of collective security. So collective security was another ideology which was spearheaded by Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. There's a great show called 30 Days, and it's the 30 days leading up to World War I. We had one incident when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a member of the Black Hand, and that just catapulted into all-out war in Europe within 30 days. So what happened? And the argument was that there were still some empires there, like you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had the Russians, you had the English. Everyone was dealing with other people behind closed doors. So you might have an agreement with someone, like if you've seen Survivor or any of those shows, it was the same thing. You're creating alliances, but none of it was transparent, none of it was open. So no one really knew or trusted someone else. So when you had a spark, it created a bonfire because everything was done in secret, in shadows. So World War I breaks out. Woodrow Wilson and the presidents of France and the Prime Minister of Britain, they essentially declared, okay, we're going to create this thing called the League of Nations. Every sovereign state, and we talked about sovereign states before, is going to be a member. And what's going to happen is that we discuss everything openly. And if you've seen the Great Hall of the United Nations, that's essentially what we're looking at is every country gets one vote. Now, the League of Nations was a precursor to the United Nations, but that the ideology of collective security was, think of the Three Musketeers, it's all for one for all. So if you invade us, if you declare war on one member state, then you're declaring war on all member states. That's where collective security came from. And the idea behind that was if we unite, then we're too big a group, too big a force for any one person to fight us for whichever reason, be it ideological, be it religious, be it financial. Now, the problem with collective security was that the United States was still a young nation at the time. So even though President Woodrow Wilson decided, hey, this is a great idea, the United States Congress refused to ratify it, so they refused to be involved. They saw World War I and Europe as Europe's problems. I mean, it was not long since they actually gained independence. It had only been 50 years since they gained independence. So Europe was still a bit of a sore point for them. They tried to get away from it, wanted to get away from the king, wanted to get away from Europe. As Robin Williams, a comedian, once said, the people who founded America were so uptight the English kicked them out. So they had wanted nothing to do with Europe. So when the idea of the League of Nations came to the United States Congress, they refused to ratify it, so America was not a member. Now, that left France and England because Russia was not involved either. And those two countries had suffered a lot during World War I because a lot of the fighting was in those countries. And they were empires that had collapsed. So when Italy, who was not a member of the League of Nations, invaded Abyssinia, which is to modern-day Ethiopia, Abyssinia, who was a member of the League, Haile Selassie, he appealed to the League. He said, look, they've invaded us. We need help. Nothing happened because France and England, everyone looked to them, but they're like, we don't have the army. We're exhausted from the war. America couldn't do anything because they weren't a member, and neither was Russia. So nothing happened. All that happened was they released a statement saying we don't recognize Italy's sovereignty over Abyssinia, even though they were there. So even though you had collective security, it was a wounded group, and they couldn't do anything. So this then, at the end, when World War II took place, this actually then created, the League of Nations just morphed into the United Nations, and we had the Bretton Woods institutions, which I'm going to go into detail next week. I think I've done a show on this, but we'll look at it again. All right. Hopefully that's just a bit of a precursor as to why we're getting into, why we go to war.
The podcast you just listened to was a live recording of a radio show, first broadcast on FreshFM with support from New Zealand On Air. FreshFM is a community access media station based in Te Tauihu, the top of the South Island, New Zealand. The funding of Access Media makes these podcasts possible. To find similar programs by other community access media stations, go online to accessmedia.nz. If you or your group would like to know more about how you can have a program on our station, please contact us. Visit our website freshfm.net for our contact details.